Good afternoon and welcome to this week's lecture. I am Christian Aldridge and I am a PhD student at Liberty University. This lecture fits into Module 4 of my 8-week graduate level readings course, Readings of 19th Century German History. The title of this lecture is Pre-Modern Nationalism and 1848 Schleswig-Holstein Conflict. This lecture covers a multitude of aspects of nationalism and German history, especially in the history of the northern German duchies of Schleswig and Holstein. These duchies consist of the border region between Denmark and what's today modern-day Germany. Long engulfed in a heated feud over the Schleswig-Holstein question, which I will be covering later and is also in your readings, the German duchies can culturally entrench themselves, fighting off consistent pressure from the Danes in the north. Through this contextual picture, pre-modern German nationalism solidified itself into these people. The primary controversy in the political science and history fields is over the creation of nationalism. Where did it begin? Secular liberal scholars believe that nationalism is only a modern construct. Modern nationalism, to them, was created during the French Revolution and was spread by Napoleon Bonaparte. This liberal nationalism, as it is called, caught on and spread throughout Europe, sparking revolutions across the continent. Now, these scholars often coin every event that happened in the Germanic states as revolutions, including the Schleswig-Holstein conflict in 1848. Conservative Christian scholars are often on the other side and believe that nationalism is not a modern construct. Rather, it was created in biblical times by God and spread outwards from Israel. These scholars are often coined perennialists, or sometimes they can also be referred to as primordialists, but let's not get into the details between the two. These two groups have argued for an extensive time. It's been quite heated between the modernists and the perennialists. Secular scholars argue against the validity of the Bible's truth and claim nationalism cannot exist without the nation, while perennialists contend that nations do not need to have modern economic and political constructs to be considered nations. Also, they argue that nationalism came before the nation. Now, this is a very important part. Ideologies can be misconstrued by where they begin. Now, can a nation only be considered a nation if it builds on its own nationalism? No. A nation is a product of nationalism. One of the most prolific scholars and a founder to interdisciplinary study in nationalism studies is Anthony D. Smith. Before his death in 2016, he wrote numerous books about nationalism. He was very influential in nationalism studies field. However, his focus was on the difference between civic and ethnic nationalisms. While he was, of course, a modernist, he still contends that nationalism had pre-modern roots. One of his works, which I have assigned to you in our reading, is titled Nationalism, Theory, Ideology, and History. First, let's go over why I chose this book. I chose it because history students, even at the graduate level, have a very small amount of knowledge about nationalism. Many, for instance, can only really make the connection between nationalism and Nazism, which two are completely separate. And it is good to have this understanding of nations and nationalism, so that when we get into a more globalist perspective, maybe in another class, then you will have a much better understanding of the constructs of nations and how they build into this international globalist society. Therefore, this introductory book stands as an incredible resource for a historical narrative that is presented in this course. Second, the historical narrative taught in this course follows the nationalist trend. It doesn't follow the mainstream narrative across the 19th century. Rather, it follows the nationalist trend that often can be seen on the side. And therefore, it would only be appropriate to provide this resource. So let's talk about the book. I specifically assigned the sections that cover pre-modern nationalism so that we can discuss them before moving on to modern nationalism. I want you to be able to understand the aspects to pre-modern nationalism before moving on to modern nationalism. I want you to be able to decipher what pre-modern nationalism is, versus later on being able to decipher what modern nationalism contains. The book introduces students to existing scholarship in the field and focuses on main theoretical contributions instead of substantial amount of empirical evidence that could muddy the book's contribution. Now, don't mistake in this. I am very empirical. I want my work to be focused on facts, and so do historical or history students. However, sometimes to get an understanding of an ideology, you have to put the empirical aside before you embrace the empirical studies of that field. His objective is to examine many theoretical, ideological, and historical facets to nationalism and the shifting focus of the field. This is also a good thing, because then students also get an understanding on not just historiography, but a little bit of a political science version of historiography as well. While this book is not the most complex, it does allow us to see the foundations of nationalist trends. This book really made large waves in the historiography of the nationalist studies and history fields. There was very few, say, beginning or basic books that detailed nationalism and its core or root aspects. And this book really was profound, because it just mapped out all these different aspects to nationalism. Now, I want to transition into the historical work that I had you complete a book review for this week, and that is the First Schleswig-Holstein War, 1848 to 1850, which is a good military history work that covers the ins and outs of the war. It also provides plenty of illustrations to foster a mental picture of what war consisted of during the era, as well as weaponry, uniforms, and personnel lists. Now, when dealing with this era, early to late 19th century, many authors still wrote personnel lists, provided a lot of illustrations, and whatnot. And it's really good, because then we can see, how units moved, how units worked, what weaponry they get to see, what they look like. And it really brings us back to that era. He argues that the causes to the war were the changing power struggle in Europe, growing nationalism, the beginnings of democracy, the conflict between the Duke of Ostendburg and the Danish king, as well as the Danish economic changes for the German duchies. He also argues that the conflict was a civil war, which is a much different perspective than the liberal secular scholars' perspective of it being a revolution. And this is a very, very influential part of this week's course, was realizing that the 1848 Schleswig-Holstein conflict was not a revolution. It wasn't revolting against itself. It was fighting against the encroachment of the Danes in a culturally and politically complex German duchy. This book is very useful when studying the conflict, as the historiography of the conflict is quite small. It really is. There isn't very many works that, especially in English, that are out there for students to learn about this work. The third and final work that I want to discuss is the second reading for the week, and that's the primary source titled The Memorial of the Schleswig-Holstein Question, addressed to the Honorable Branford R. Wood, Minister to the Court of Denmark in Copenhagen. This work is a primary source that details the argument of the Schleswig-Holstein question, one of the primary causes to the 1848 Schleswig-Holstein conflict, which it is. It is a very long, very detailed, very complex problem that those duchies dealt with for an extended period of time. It covers the culture of the regions, especially from a German perspective. It outlines the political, cultural, military, genealogical, and ethnic issues surrounding the Schleswig-Holstein question. Now, the Schleswig-Holstein question, it involved, as you read in that book, a lot of different facets, and it really brought a interesting perspective when it comes to international politics, especially involving Denmark, the Germanic states, Great Britain, Russia, Sweden, even France. It goes to show, as we saw earlier, how the genealogical lines in Europe had an influence on the political international scene. Thank you very much for watching this week's lecture, and I hope to see you again next week. Thank you.